Everything within the state, nothing outside the state, nothing against the state. Let's just dive right into this explainer, right? Because that is the literal blueprint for totalitarianism, straight from the guy who actually coined the word. You see, while Joseph Stalin was busy building this massive totalitarian machine on the far left, Benito Mussolini was crafting the architecture for fascism on the far right. And honestly, it's all neatly wrapped up in that one chilling quote. Welcome to this deep dive explainer. If you're a leaving cert student looking to seriously master the structural weaknesses and historiographical debates of early 20th century Italy, you are in exactly the right place. To grab those high marks, it's absolutely vital to understand one main thing: the massive, undeniable gap between what Mussolini's regime claimed to be on paper and what it actually achieved in reality. So here's how we're going to break down our analysis today. We'll start with the exploitation of chaos, move into the illusion of the strong state, then hit the fatal flaw of aggression, and finally wrap up with the spectacular collapse. All right, part one, the exploitation of chaos. Let's look at how the chaos right after World War I essentially allowed conservative elites to just dismantle liberal democracy, handing the keys over to a former socialist journalist. When you're evaluating this regime, you really have to grasp just how incredibly fragile Italy's liberal democracy was at the time. After the war, Italians felt deeply, deeply humiliated by what they called the Mutilated Victory at the Treaty of Versailles. Basically, they were denied the territories they were promised. Plus, the economy was completely bankrupt and inflation was literally out of control. And on top of all that, wealthy Italians were absolutely terrified by the recent Bolshevik Revolution. They watched in sheer horror during the Biennio Rosso, the 2 red years, as communist strikes and peasant land seizures just swept across the country. The traditional political class looked totally powerless. And Mussolini, well, he stepped right into that vacuum, pitching his violent Blackshirts as the one and only force capable of restoring law and order. Now, what's truly fascinating here is the sheer contrast between the myth of a violent Blackshirt coup and the actual historical reality. In October 1922, Mussolini basically pulled off a massive bluff. He threatened to march on Rome with about 40,000 poorly armed Blackshirts. Honestly, the regular army could have crushed them in a heartbeat. But instead, King Victor Emmanuel III panicked. He was terrified of a civil war. So the conservative elites essentially just invited Mussolini in. He was legally appointed prime minister before he even arrived in Rome, on a very comfortable sleeper train, no less. Okay, moving on to part two, the illusion of the strong state. You know, once he actually got into power, Mussolini didn't just become a dictator overnight. For the first couple of years, he operated within the democratic system, all while quietly dismantling it from the inside out. So, the absolute crucial turning point to highlight for your essays is this massive escalation in 1924, the Matteotti Crisis. After a socialist politician named Giacomo Matteotti bravely exposed fascist election fraud, he was brutally murdered by fascist thugs. In protest, opposition MPs literally walked out of parliament, the Aventine secession, hoping the king would finally step in. But he didn't. Instead, Mussolini took this massive, massive gamble. He claimed, quote-unquote, moral and historical responsibility for the atmosphere of violence, and then used the crisis to pass the Rocco laws, completely banning rival parties and trade unions. And from there, backed by his terrifying secret police, the OVRA, Mussolini started building this truly omnipresent cult of personality. He was arguably the very first modern leader to fully weaponize cinema. He used loose newsreels to project this image of himself as a tireless, invincible genius. Get this, he even left the lights on in his office all night just to make people think he literally never slept. And it wasn't just adults. Youth groups like the Balilla were set up to completely indoctrinate kids with the famous slogan you'd see painted all over the country: believe, obey, fight. Now, if we look at his economic campaigns, it perfectly captures that massive gap between propaganda and reality. Definitely keep these details in mind, because it is absolute textbook material for your exams when you need to contrast the flashy facade of his domestic battles with the actual economic fallout. Mussolini pushed hard for autarky, total food self-sufficiency. And sure, while the battle for land gave him some amazing propaganda shots of a shirtless Il Duce draining the Pontine marshes, his other battles really misallocated resources. The battle for grain, for example, it actually crippled agricultural diversity by tearing up highly profitable vineyards. And the battle for births, which was designed to balloon the population to build a massive 60 million strong army, it was a total failure. The birth rate actually dropped in the 1930s. That being said, Mussolini did manage to pull off a massive, undeniably huge diplomatic victory with the Lateran Treaty in 1929. By finally making peace with the Pope and officially recognizing Vatican City as an independent state, Mussolini neutralized his single biggest potential institutional rival. It was a brilliant move, really, because it completely solidified his grip on conservative, rural Italians who might otherwise have been pretty skeptical of this radical fascist government. Catholicism became the state religion, and he got immense legitimacy in return. But you really have to ask yourself, how do you actually sustain a regime that's built entirely on the promise of relentless action and strength? Because inherently, fascism requires continuous, dynamic expansion and violence just to justify its own existence at home. A regime built on the image of an unstoppable conqueror simply cannot survive in a state of quiet peace. It needs a war. Which brings us right to part 3, the fatal flaw of aggression. This is where we see a massive shift from cautious diplomacy straight into ideological recklessness, the shift that would ultimately doom the Italian fascist state. Early on, Mussolini actually played the role of peacekeeper. He even signed the Stresa Front in 1935 with Britain and France to contain Hitler's early moves in Austria. But Mussolini had this desperate, driving need for military prestige. He had this grand ambition to turn the Mediterranean back into Mare Nostrum, our sea, just like the ancient Roman Empire. And that obsession led him to prioritize a highly reckless imperial agenda over making sure his economy was actually ready for a fight. To build out this empire and, let's be honest, to distract from his domestic economic struggles, Mussolini launched a brutally aggressive invasion of Abyssinia, modern-day Ethiopia, in October 1935. He used modern tanks, bombers, and even outlawed poison gas. This invasion is such a central case study for the collapse of collective security. Because when Emperor Haile Selassie begged for help, the League of Nations totally exposed its absolute toothlessness. Sure, they imposed some weak sanctions, but they crucially failed to ban oil or close the Suez Canal. And the consequence? It proved to both Mussolini and Hitler that the democratic powers totally lacked the political will to actually stop aggression. Now, consider this vital historiographical shift. This is absolute gold for your comparative essays. After being totally isolated by the West over the Abyssinia invasion, Mussolini aligned himself tightly with Hitler through the Rome-Berlin axis, and eventually the Pact of Steel. When Mussolini finally jumped into World War II in June 1940, basically because he thought France was already beaten and he wanted a seat at the peace table, his fragile, autarkic economy just couldn't handle it. After suffering humiliating, severely undersupplied military disasters in places like Egypt and Greece, Hitler literally had to bail him out. The power dynamic entirely inverted. In 1934, Mussolini was the senior, respected statesman mentoring a volatile Hitler. By 1940, Italy was just a dependent secondary power, completely trapped in Hitler's war. And that downward spiral leads us to part 4, the spectacular collapse. Now we're looking at the rapid, incredibly dramatic unraveling of a regime that was fundamentally unequipped for an industrial-scale war. It's one of the most violent downfalls in modern history. Following the Allied invasion of Sicily in July 1943, Mussolini's fall was spectacular. Tracing the timeline of these critical plot points, you can see just how incredibly fast his absolute control shattered. Realizing that Italy was facing total destruction, his own inner circle turned on him. The fascist Grand Council actually voted him out, and the king had him arrested. But Hitler wasn't quite done with him. In September, he launched a daring, crazy glider raid at Gran Sasso, rescuing Il Duce without firing a single shot. After the rescue, Hitler essentially forced Mussolini to set up the Solar Republic, a totally weak puppet state in German-occupied northern Italy. Historians always emphasize that this specific era represents the absolute degradation of Italian fascism. A brutal civil war erupted against Italian partisans. Mussolini, who was now just a powerless puppet fully controlled by Nazi ideology, even allowed the Gestapo to deport thousands of Italian Jews to concentration camps. It was a stark, unimaginably dark shift from his pre-war autonomy. The end finally came in April 1945. Attempting to flee to Switzerland disguised in a German military overcoat, Mussolini was recognized by partisans, captured, and executed. The grim aftermath in Milan of Piazzale Loreto, where his body was hung upside down from the girders of a petrol station, wasn't just about revenge. The public defilement of his body served as this violent collective catharsis for a nation that was absolutely desperate to conclusively prove the fascist era was over and to somehow cleanse itself of its own complicity. Ultimately, what all of this exposes is a critical structural difference for your comparative essays. Fascism in Italy was simply never as deeply institutionalized as totalitarianism was in the USSR.
Unlike Stalin, who totally and ruthlessly liquidated all rival power bases, Mussolini left the monarchy intact. So when the ultimate crisis hit in 1943, King Victor Emmanuel III actually still possessed the constitutional authority to legally dismiss the dictator. It completely proved the regime's foundational weakness.
As we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with this final thought. Was the brutal ending in Piazzale Loreto merely a military defeat, or was it the inevitable consequence of a system built purely on propaganda? Mussolini crafted an incredible, dazzling illusion of strength, but at the end of the day, a nation cannot sustain an industrial war on newsreels and slogans alone. Keep these structural flaws and realities in mind for your studies, and, as always, keep questioning the history behind the headlines.